Hello, this is Dan Donovan, your instructor for the OLLI Fall 2020 course, 4 Centuries of American Architecture. This is a new recording of the first lecture done by Zoom on Thursday, October 10th. As you know, that session suffered from technical and other problems. This recording should be much clearer and easier to understand. You're welcome to use the video as you wish and on your own time, watching the whole thing or jumping around using the scroll at the bottom of the screen, just like a YouTube video. Lecture 1. One of the books I suggest reading is Why Architecture Matters, written in 2009 by the architecture critic Paul Goldberger. I'd like to start by going to some of his chapters to talk about how we experience architecture, about some aspects of architecture that we respond to, consciously or not, and about what makes, in the title of the other book I suggested reading, The Architecture of Happiness. Architecture begins to matter, Goldberger writes, when it brings delight and sadness and perplexity and awe along with a roof over our heads. When it begins to say something about the world, when it begins to take on the qualities of art. We're going to talk about some of the qualities of architecture as art, qualities that most of the buildings we'll look at have in common. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright liked to say that architecture began when he started building his horizontal houses on the American prairie. But Wright's contemporary, German-born Mies van der Rohe, known as Mies, the architect of the Seagram Building in 1958 in New York, shown here with him, Mies said, more poetically and more modestly than Wright, that architecture began the first time 2 bricks were put together well. Bricks put together well here in an ordinary running bond, meaning that the stretchers follow one another and the joints vertically alternate. Now that would have made up the long projecting walls of Mies's brick country house of 1923, an unbuilt project, but a design expression that few had seen in architecture before. Mies managed to get something built in brick, a memorial to the murdered Marxists Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in Berlin in 1926. The Nazis destroyed it as soon as they came to power. Mies's early modern house for Karl Lemke in 1932 in Berlin gives us an idea of how the brick country house might have looked at a much smaller scale. Brick laid in running bond ripples across the 19th century federal-style bow fronts of townhouses in Louisburg Square on Beacon Hill in Boston. This neoclassic English country house, I don't know its name or when it was built, is dressed in Flemish bond, in which brick stretchers, the long side of the brick, and headers, the short side, alternate. The architect played with the details, such as in the pilaster that isn't quite there, topped by an Ionic capital and the keystone that drops over the window, but the result is restrained and elegant. Brick and its cousin, terracotta, literally baked earth, the number 1889 is made of terracotta. It bursts into 3 dimensions in this exuberant facade in Chicago. And in this 19th century dairy, the terracotta cattle in the pediment is art of a high order. The brick mason displays his artistry as this building turns a corner, and there's firmness and delight in this pleated brick facade. And you can be sure that each of these clinker bricks was selected and laid as artfully as those in the elegant English country house. This building is the Ningbo Historical Museum in the city of Ningbo, south of Shanghai on the China coast. It was designed by the Chinese architect Wang Shu, winner of the 2012 Pritzker Architecture Prize, the Nobel Prize of the architecture world. Ningbo, with a population over 8 million, is one of China's oldest cities. But like all Chinese cities, Ningbo has been subject to relentless redevelopment. Wang Shu clad the building in abundant recycled building materials from the Ningbo region. He and his brickmasons artfully composed them in stacks and patterns and highlighted individual specimens. It's a building you want to touch. The architect and author Vitruvius, writing in ancient Rome around 30 BC, set out three elements of architecture: commodity, firmness, and delight. This simple description sums up an architectural paradox. A building must be useful, commodity, while at the same time it must be the opposite of useful, since art, or as Vitruvius would put it, delight, is ephemeral and has no real function. Moreover, a building must be constructed according to the laws of engineering. Firmness, which is to say it must stand up. Vitruvius doesn't rank the three elements in order of importance. They can be said in any order. They're independent and interdependent. It's a matter of the elements' coexistence. To qualify as architecture, a building must simultaneously be useful, well-built, and visually appealing. Without firmness and delight, commodity is nothing. And delight needs firmness, not only to hold the building up, but so the art of architecture can reach its greatest expression. Buildings have meanings. They embody and express culture, and they serve as symbols. This is the Barcelona Pavilion, designed by Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich. It was the German National Pavilion for the 1929 International Exposition in Barcelona. 10 years after World War I, commissioners directed the architects to, quote, give voice to the spirit of a new era, unquote. The pavilion was used for the official opening of the German section of the exposition, specifically to receive King Alfonso XII on his official tour. The Barcelona Pavilion is known for its simple form and for its spectacular use of extravagant materials. The origins of the pavilion's floor plan are in the floor plan are in Mies's project for a brick country house, but here the walls slide by each other rather than project. Where the country house is expansive, the Barcelona Pavilion is more contained. The blue rectangles are reflecting ponds. The gray rectangles are roofs over the reception room and the small office at upper left. Visitors enter up a short flight of stairs, up to a terrace of square travertine tiles in a grid, and into the pavilion. Walking through the pavilion, veneers of 4 different kinds of marble glide by: Roman travertine, green marble from Greece and the Alps, golden onyx from the Atlas Mountains, and glass tinted gray, green, and white. The reflecting pools are like mirrors. The cloud-colored ceiling seems to be held down rather than supported by the chromed cruciform columns looking impossibly thin. The only 2 chairs, the original iconic Barcelona chair, were made for just the king, or were made just for the king. The architecture of happiness suggests that a building is a repository of memory and possibility, of flawed reality and imagined perfection. It shelters what we value. It compensates for what is missing from our lives. Meaning, culture, and symbol The Barcelona Pavilion represented a new Weimar Germany in 1929, democratic, culturally progressive, prosperous, and thoroughly pacifist. It was a national self-portrait in architecture and the ultimate physical representation of a culture. The pavilion itself was the exhibit. The Barcelona Pavilion was destroyed in 1930 after the exposition closed, but architecture students like me have studied it ever since. It was reconstructed in the 1980s in the same location, and that's what we've been looking at here. I've never seen a color photograph of the original pavilion. Now, the highest and best art of all kinds, not just architecture, doesn't coddle the viewer. It challenges. Architecture can expand human possibility in ways that are hard to understand, and experiencing it can be troubling, even shocking. Much architecture that aspires to high art is not particularly beautiful by conventional standards. That's true of Louis I. Kahn's First Unitarian Church of Rochester, New York. It doesn't look much like a church, let alone a beautiful one. But art, at its most important, is not merely a matter of looking at beautiful things. It forces us to see things differently, breaking through convention and changing our notions of what our culture can produce. That's true of Wright's Prairie Houses and true of the Barcelona Pavilion that we just looked at. Kahn said, "It's not worth it to use marble for what you don't believe in, but it's worth it to use cinder blocks for that which you do believe in." Lou Kahn, a non-observant Jew but given to gnomic pronouncements, believed in light and shadow. Look at how sun and shadow modulate this rhythmic series of windows, not unlike his sketch of the Temple of Konos in Karnak, Egypt, in 1951. Kahn said, "I sense light as the giver of all presences, and material as spent light. What is made by light casts a shadow, and the shadow belongs to light. Architecture appears for the first time when sunlight hits a wall." Kahn brings light into the sanctuary through 4 towers over the 4 corners of the room. Light enters the towers and falls down across the raw concrete block walls. The ceiling is made of poured-in-place concrete. With the corners open to the light towers, it appears to float over the middle of the sanctuary like a canopy. The beauty of this space and the humble concrete block may not be apparent at first glance, but emerges after time spent there. What about comfort? Especially in houses, great architecture can be hard to live with. Goldberger uses the examples of Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie of 1929 near Paris and Mises' Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois. Both houses brought their owners genuine anguish, mainly over leaks. "Perfect architecture does not make our lives perfect," writes Goldberger. And he quotes one of my favorite passages from The Architecture of Happiness. "The noblest architecture can sometimes do less for us than a siesta or an aspirin. Even if we could spend the rest of our lives in the Villa Rotunda or the Glass House, we would still often be in a bad mood." Dr. Farnsworth was challenged by her house. She felt exposed there, and it leaked, but she stayed with it for 18 years. Then she moved to France. Perhaps challenge is not the right word for experiencing architecture. Perhaps intensity of feeling is a better phrase. Our relationship to a building almost always begins with the way it looks. A building is an object in the physical world, and it must be understood, experienced, and judged that way. Architecture depends for its effectiveness on the extent to which the portions of a structure relate to each other and to the whole, and also how they relate to the human form and to the larger landscape in which they sit. The physical reality of buildings obliges us to think of them, first and foremost, as objects. How are we to regard these objects? Is the facade the first thing to look at? Indeed, there may be more than one facade. Should we look at the sides? How about the back? Or do we look at all the sides to come together to create a coherent single entity, a work of art? What about materials, ornament, and decoration? Is the building true to a traditional style, if that's the way it's designed, or is it new and different, to be judged by the extent to which it is unlike anything we've seen before? There really are no rules. For example, look at the Lincoln Memorial as an object. The architect Henry Bacon loosely based the memorial on the Parthenon in ancient Greece. The Lincoln Memorial is a Greek temple in one sense, and in another sense, not a Greek temple at all. Paul Goldberger writes, the architect Henry Bacon created a masterwork that in many ways is as inventive and original as the modernist buildings created in Europe at the same time, 1915 to 1922, that the Lincoln Memorial was designed. Rather than replicate a Greek temple, Bacon used the vocabulary of Greco-Roman architecture to create an immense formal box to memorialize Lincoln, to stand as a symbol of American certitude and conviction at the time of the Civil War. The Lincoln Memorial is not a structure supported by columns like the Parthenon, but an immense marble box surrounded by a colonnade of 36 Doric columns. The walls of the box are set inside behind the columns, and the walls of the box rise behind them much higher than they are. The effect is of a classical coating wrapped around the brooding, primal form of a barely ornamented box. Bacon makes no attempt to mimic the appearance of a Greek temple. The metopes and triglyphs of a classical frieze are repurposed to American commemorative symbols. The hardness of the sharply defined architecture plays off the relative softness of Daniel Chester French's Lincoln statue, and the heaviness of the boxy structure is lightened by the columns and their shadows. This is the west side. The columns and the space behind them express a dialectic between solid and void, light and shadow, looking here up the mall to the Capitol. The Lincoln Memorial is part of an ensemble of civic monuments, the National Mall. The memorial closes off the vista that begins with the United States Capitol, 2 miles to the east, as called for in the Macmillan Plan of the National Mall, for the National Mall in 1902. Where the entrances are on the short sides of a Greek temple, Henry Bacon rotated the Lincoln Memorial so that the long side serves as the main facade and entrance to better address the Capitol at the other end of the 2-mile mall. He also eliminated the gabled roof and decorated pediment typical of real Greek temples, shown in this reconstruction of the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, they would have been where the red lines are here. He replaced them with flat roofs, making the building look all the more abstract. West of the Memorial Bridge makes a physical and symbolic connection to Arlington Cemetery, where the Lincoln Memorial can be seen from the Greek Revival Custis Lee Mansion on what was Robert E. Lee's plantation, Arlington. Speaking of firmness, the Lincoln Memorial is not only an architectural masterpiece, it's an engineering marvel as well. While the memorial appears to be built on a hill, in reality it sits atop a tall foundation wall, which itself rests on pilings driven deep into the location's marshy soil. Not all the firmness needs to be seen. As we've said, when you think of a building as an object, you think about its overall shape, about the quality of its facade, and of how the other sides might read as compositions. You look at color and materials. You consider it in relation to the buildings around it. There is another dimension to buildings, and that is the way you feel when you go inside them. Buildings are created to enclose space. The reality of architecture consists as much of space as form, and the nature and feel of the space within can mean as much or even more than anything else about the building. Whatever form it takes, interior space will almost always provoke a greater emotional response than the outside of a building does. In The Architecture of Humanism, Sir Geoffrey Scott wrote, "Space is, quote, unquote, nothing, a mere negation of the solid, and thus we tend to overlook it. But though we may overlook it, space affects us and can control our spirit. The architect molds space as a sculptor molds in clay. He designs his space as a work of art. That is, he attempts through its means to excite a certain mood in those who enter it. Space can be directed and feel as if it's made to encourage you to keep moving through it. This is the Beijing Capital International Airport, where a funnel-shaped terminal building encloses a funnel-shaped space that keeps you moving towards the gates and baggage claim. Or space can be focused. The Pantheon in Rome does not make you want to move through it. You feel as though you understand it better if you stay put under the perfect half-sphere dome. Even if you are not in the very center of the space, you feel as if the force of the space is focused on you.
This is the Pantheon, one of the world's most amazing monuments. Right. And there we are. It's a spectacle.
Built in 118 AD, this is a temple to gods no one now worships, but it still inspires awe and wonder.
The first time I saw it is just like it is now. You're uplifted. You feel a kind of joy at being in the presence of such an extraordinary thing.
When Emperor
In the Parthenon, the thing that is supposed to move is the light falling into the great space through the oculus, the round opening at the top of the dome, and it lands on the floor in a disk of sun. Where there is only glass, the dividing line between inside and outside is not very apparent, and the space itself becomes deliberately ambiguous. There is considerable spatial ambiguity in Philip Johnson's Glass House, where the floor is nearly at the level of the lawn. The glass is clear to the point of invisibility, and the frame is virtually the same color as the trees. You may as well be outside. Though you feel similarly exposed in Mises' Farnsworth House, the ambiguity is a little lesser. The white frame lends more of a sense of enclosure. The ceiling projects, and you are well above ground. At the $5 billion Apple Park in Cupertino, California, deliberate ambiguity reigns at the Steve Jobs Theater. The floor appears to float uninterrupted across the terrace. The curved glass panels support the single-piece 155-foot diameter metallic carbon fiber roof. The thin black strips between the curved panels contain wiring and fire safety sprinklers. All the building components move separately, and should ride out a magnitude 8 earthquake. The glass cylinder across the room is an elevator because this is just the lobby. The $179 million 1,000-seat auditorium is underground. Now we're back in Baroque space here compared to the Steve Jobs Theater. No doubt John Portman's primary motivation in the design of the Marriott Marquis Hotel in Atlanta was the creation of a soaring atrium, his trademark, this one higher and more shapely and sensuous than anything before. Putting a prominent bulge in what would otherwise have been a fairly typical double-loaded corridor high-rise hotel enabled that space. Because of its bulging base, it is sometimes referred to locally as the Pregnant Building, sometimes as the Coca-Cola Building, since it looks like a bottle of Coke from the side elevation. That's apparent, especially in the shape of the atrium, and that means a lot in Atlanta. Now, I like this building very much, although, or maybe because, the lobby reminds me of Geppetto in the stomach of the whale in Pinocchio. In the Marriott, your eyes go up as soon as you pass through a low entrance. And so it is at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. Frank Lloyd Wright had an idea of how a viewer would move through his architecture always in his mind. In a device that Wright employed many times, you enter the museum through a low-ceilinged, almost dim entrance. You see the great space before you. Then, almost involuntarily, your eyes are drawn up through the spiraling ramp railings to the great skylight. The greatest architecture inspires awe, special, intense, poetically crafted space, what Le Corbusier called ineffable space, space incapable of being described in words. It's architecture's highest aesthetic achievement. It's here in Lou Kahn's library at Phillips Exeter Academy, opened in 1971 in New Hampshire. Vitruvius called for delight, and indeed great architecture can evoke indescribable joy. I've found it in every cathedral, and especially in Kahn's Salk Institute of 1963 in La Jolla, every time I've been there. Watch how the architecture appears when the sunlight hits the walls, just as Kahn said it would. It's space that, along with the water element, directs you to the view of the Pacific Ocean. Architectural space connects inevitably to movement, and a building's floor plan is the guide to that movement. It doesn't represent space, but it implies space. A floor plan is a kind of two-dimensional diagram of the three-dimensional design. Here's the floor plan of Wright's Robie House of 1910 in Chicago, one of his grand horizontal prairie houses. Exaggerated overhangs, wall copings, and Roman brick emphasize the horizontality. As is often in a Wright house, there seems to be no front door. The back of the house, and there really is no back to a Wright house, has all the architectural character of the street side, and that's where we find the front door. You enter a low-ceilinged entry hall, go up the stairs, turn, and you're in the great room on the second floor. It's a single volume of space, divided into living and dining areas by a big fireplace, typical of Wright. Sunlight pours through art glass doors and windows that line the room. The floor plan strongly implies that you are to move through this space along the windows, emphasizing the horizontal character of the roof of the house itself. Not unlike the floor plan of the Barcelona Pavilion. The architect Paul Rudolph, whose Florida roots we'll look at in a future class, said of Frank Lloyd Wright, "Those of you who've experienced a Wright building," something didn't come in here. Those of you who've experienced a Wright building, or for that matter, any first-rate work of architecture, know that the sense of space is immediately apparent. No one has to tell you or explain it to you at all. This is Paul Rudolph's Art and Architecture building at Yale University, completed in 1964. Sometimes a floor plan is not enough to suggest the spatial character of a building. With up and down arrows and at lots of steps, the floor plan hints at spatial undulations at floor level. But a floor plan can't fully represent the complexity of a 7-story space that contains some 35 levels. Landings, mezzanines, bridges and balconies, and implied planes of lighting fixtures. So a building section, a cutaway view, gives us a better idea, but even that's kind of incomplete. The drawing might look much different and be more useful if you move the section cut forward and backward, looking at several sections, but it would need a lot of sections to understand the space that way. However, Rudolph was a phenomenal draftsman, famous for his cutaway perspective drawings that give us a better and much more dramatic idea of the space we move through. Arrangements of buildings create a place. This is Central Park in New York City. Central Park was designed by landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted and architect Calvert Vaux. The park opened to the public in 1858. Over the next century and a half, buildings around Central Park grew denser and taller until the park's 840 acres were surrounded by a continuous frame, a hard edge of buildings of roughly the same height and in a close family of colors, and taller than the trees in the park. This is Fifth Avenue and Central Park West on the Upper West Side. The park's designers intended Central Park to be a refuge from the crowded, noisy streets of New York, the lungs of the city, Olmsted called it. And there are places in Central Park, this is the Ramble for one, a good place for bird watching, where Olmsted's ingenious design makes it easy to forget you're in America's biggest city. Other places remind you that you are surrounded, even embraced, by one of the great cities of the world. This is the Great Lawn, site of concerts and sunbathing and protests. The buildings keep getting taller, more expensive, and ever more expensive. The unprecedented exclusive views from the new ultra-tall ultra-slender residential towers on so-called Billionaires Row on the park's south end will forever change the park, and in the near future, park users may feel literally looked down upon, not to mention the long shadows on the park and vegetation. We'll look at these so-called super slenders later. New York City's dense grid holds surprises. On East 53rd Street, there's another rectangular park, much smaller, a pocket park, Paley Park, slipped between buildings on the lot once occupied by New York's fabled Stork Club. Paley Park is very much an urban space, only 50 feet wide by 100 feet deep, about a tenth of an acre. The sidewalk at Paley Park Stoop is heavily traveled. People are drawn into the park off the busy sidewalk to sit at the tables with the sound of the 20-foot high waterfall all around them. It masks the noise of the city and makes a comfortable place for conversation because it's difficult to overhear others over the sound of the waterfall. My notes say that this slide is the halfway point. It's a good place to stop for a break. Let's step back a few thousand years. The architectural historian Vincent Scully said that the Pueblo Indians of the American Southwest were the most communally minded builders of urban architecture that the continent had ever seen. Other Native Americans built monumental buildings. The Grave Creek Mound in the Ohio River Valley in West Virginia is one of the largest conical-type burial mounds in the United States. 240 feet in diameter, the mound now stands 62 feet high. The builders, members of the Adena culture, moved more than 60,000 tons of dirt to create the mound in about 250 to 150 BC. Lake Jackson Mounds Archaeological State Park in Leon County preserves the remains of 6 of 7 known earthen temple mounds there. The largest mound is 278 feet by 312 feet at the base and approximately 36 feet high. The village at the base of these mounds was a cultural, religious, and population center in 1100 to 1500 AD. The Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, is decorated with an earth-formed, cosmically aligned snake, or serpent, 1,348 feet long and 3 feet high. It dates from 1070 AD. A representation of a mound builder's village in Nodina, Arkansas. The mounds were reserved for religious buildings, ossuaries, and the houses of the elite. This is a reconstruction of a Wattle and Daub house at Etowah Indian Mounds Park in Georgia. Wattle and Daub is a composite building method used for making walls and buildings, in which a woven lattice of wooden strips called wattle is daubed with a sticky material made of wet soil, clay, sand, animal dung, and straw. Wattle and daub has been used for at least 6,000 years and is still an important construction method in many parts of the world. A Pawnee Earth Lodge village photographed in 1871. The Earth Lodge was the predominant dwelling of central and northern Great Plains village Indians. The earthen structures were circular, dome-shaped dwellings over a timbered framework covered by branches, grass, and finally earth. Encountering similar topography and available building materials, the sodbusters of the 19th century American land rush built similar structures. The Iroquois Longhouse is a framework of posts and poles covered with sheets of bark, 180 to 220 feet long. The length of a longhouse was determined by the size of the extended family living in it. The larger the family, the longer the longhouse. Palisades surrounded Iroquois villages to protect them from attack by other peoples and wild animals and from blowing snow. In the Mesa Verde area of the Southwest, circa AD 1 to 450, the first of the Anasazi people, the basket makers, lived in caves on the sides of their deep canyons and raised crops on the flat mesa tops far above. Later basket makers, AD 450 to 750, moved up out of the caves to the mesa and dug themselves pit houses near their fields. The first pits were roughly circular, developing into rectangular types in which 4 timber posts supported slanted rafters covered with brush and earth. Entrance was by ladder through a smoke hole in the roof. The appearance of kivas, round underground rooms for meeting and worship, shows that specialization among structures had begun. In the Great or Classic Pueblo period, circa 1100 to 1300, a higher number of kivas were built, and the apartment house-like villages began to be enclosed in a single shape within one thick wall. The finest of these surviving is the Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, south of Mesa Verde. 1,000 people lived in a vast D shape, rising to 5 stories in the curve. Large kivas were built in the courtyards, packed round with earth and surrounded with rooms. The rubble masonry is faced with various patterns of slim stones laid flat. Doorways were lined in a series known in Western architecture as enfilade, a suite of rooms with doorways in line with each other, as here at Versailles. The kivas enclosed monumental interior spaces, as at Casa Rinconada here and others at Chaco Canyon, or in the Pueblo at Aztec. Many kivas were sited in topographically commanding positions. Much of the kiva's cylinder might project above ground now, as here at Aztec, making a cosmic relationship between man-made and natural forms. This is the interior of the Great Kiva at Pueblo Aztec. Of course, bringing the circular form up and out of the ground allowed for windows. Circa 1200, most of the population moved its villages back off the mesa tops down to long, shallow caverns in the canyon walls. No one knows why. A few of the large concentrations of villages at Mesa Verde, such as Spruce Tree House and Cliff Palace, show a fully developed spatial rhythm of square and circle, of rectangular and cylindrical towers, interspersed with kivas, commodity, firmness, at least for a while, and delight. By the 13th century, the old Anasazi sites were almost all abandoned. People moved south and dispersed, some into new pueblos such as Acoma and Taos. With Spanish colonization, they came to be governed by the province of Nueva Mexico, part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. We'll get back to Taos. Let's look now at the architecture of the Spanish colonies. The 3 great powers in colonial North America were Spain, France, and Great Britain. Each nationality had a distinct, architectural response to where they were on the continent. This 1599 engraving, Nueva Hispania Tabula Nova, or the new map of New Spain, shows the viceroyalty of New Spain at its height, when it included the southwestern and central United States, Florida, Central America, parts of the West Indies, as well as the Philippines. Philip II of Spain promulgated the Laws of the Indies in 1573. The laws were meant to bring order to far-flung, haphazard Spanish colonies. Here are plans for Caracas, Lima, Santiago de Cuba, Los Angeles, Buenos Aires, Los Angeles, and Mexico City. The 148 ordinances in the Laws of the Indies provided specific guidelines for all aspects of how a town should be configured. In Ordinance number 112, the main plaza is to be the starting point of the town. If the town is situated on the seacoast, it should be placed at the landing place at the port, but inland it should be at the center of the town. The plaza should be square or rectangular, as this is the space best for fiestas in which horses are used and for any other fiestas that should be held. This is Albuquerque, New Mexico, founded in 1706, its plaza framed by civic buildings and the church. The laws dictated that settlers should try to have the buildings all of one type for the sake of the beauty of the town. The laws were highly specific, stipulating where to place civic buildings, homes, and businesses on a grid of streets emanating from the main plaza. St. Augustine, Florida, founded in 1565, was laid out according to the Laws of the Indies. This 1783 map shows the church facing the Plaza Mayor, from which streets emanate into the city. The irregularity of the streets is due, no doubt, to the Spaniards' unsophisticated surveying tools at the time, but they made for charming streets for future tourists. An early 20th century postcard of Charlotte Street, a popular view in turn-of-the-century postcards from St. Augustine. Wooden balconies overhang the street. Today, St. George Street, spruced up, is a popular shopping street. St. George Street again. As a rule, the 17th century Spanish colonial houses shared these characteristics. A cypress shake or shingle roof at 26 to 55 degrees slope. Chimneys in later houses. The early houses were heated by braziers, and there was no smoke hole for the smoke to get out. It must have been pretty smoky. The chimneys came later. The balcony roof is an extension of the main roof. The entry is at a gate at the street, the entry to the courtyard. Windows are multi-paned and sash windows. Glass was expensive, and bigger pieces of glass were even more expensive. And at the second story, there's wood clapboard over a wall constructed of tabby. A tabby is a type of concrete made by burning oyster shells to make lime, then mixing it with water, sand, ash, and broken oyster shells. British colonists also employed tabby in the Carolinas and Georgia. There were variations in doors, windows, balconies, roofs. This is the Yambias House on St. Francis Street, built in 1727, and the Gonzalez Alvarez House, built in 1727, and the oldest surviving Spanish colonial dwelling in St. Augustine. The oldest house was St. Augustine's first tourist attraction. This house was built of coquina, a natural shell stone that the colonists quarried. The thick walls were coated with lime and whitewashed. The house looked like this in 1936, when it was recorded by the Historic American Buildings Survey. Rather than a balcony, there's a loggia overlooking the street. The house was enlarged over several colonial administrations, Spanish, British, American, from its initial one-story construction in 1727, two enlargements by Sergeant Major Joseph Pivot, a wood-framed second floor added in around 1775, and additional rooms at the rear in 1788, and the final enlargements from 1886 to 1900. The loggia at the back of the house would not be out of place in New Orleans. This image was taken from inside the enclosed courtyard toward the end of the 19th century. The two round concrete tower and Victorian-style elements of the 1890s were removed in a 1960 restoration intended to depict what the house would have looked like in the 18th century. The Spanish pattern of house at the street line, gate into courtyard behind the house, was the pattern in the French Quarter, the Vieux Carré, in New Orleans, founded by the French in 1718, but ceded to the Spanish, who governed from 1763 until the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. During Spanish administration, New Orleans suffered two great fires in 1788 and 1794, which destroyed the majority of its buildings. After the fire, the city had to be completely rebuilt, resulting in virtually all colonial architecture in the French Quarter of New Orleans being Spanish. It was the Spanish who required all buildings to be built of masonry construction, built to the street line and abutting each other. Spanish building patterns in New Orleans continued into the 19th century. West of Louisiana, the Spanish established their first mission, San Francisco de la Espada, in 1632 near San Angelo, Texas. Following government policy, Franciscan missionaries sought to make life within the mission communities closely resemble that of Spanish villages and Spanish culture. There was some resistance. They modified European Baroque forms in accordance with the primitive resources of the frontier. Close to Taos Pueblo, Spanish missionaries built the Church of San Francisco at Ranchos de Taos between 1772 and 1816. The Pueblo of Taos and the Church of San Francisco de Asís at Ranchos de Taos demonstrate how building with adobe tends naturally to produce simplified, plastic, strongly modeled shapes that can seem strangely scaled and abstract. You can see the massive adobe walls in the plan of the church. The Latin cross probably became less and less rectangular or rectilinear as construction progressed due to the irregularity of the adobe units. The walls are massive in section, especially in the buttress at the east end on the left. The abstract character of San Francisco at Taos continues to attract artists, notably Georgia O'Keeffe, who lived and painted in Taos. This is a series of paintings of the Rancho Church. Photographer Ansel Adams photographed it in color in 1948. Now, Taos, the church at Taos and the much older San Esteban at Acoma, built in 1630, can be compared to the Metropolitan Cathedral of the Assumption of the Most Blessed Virgin Mary into Heaven in Mexico City, under construction at the same time. The two churches show the contrast between the Mexican and American forms of Spanish colonial architecture. The Mexican cathedral might not be out of place in Europe, at the center of a metropolitan capital, facing an urban square. Elaborate in profile, the cathedral's facade has all the liveliness of Baroque architecture, while San Esteban at Acoma stands atop a huge boulder facing a view across a canyon. San Esteban's architecture, compared to the Mexican cathedral, is simplified, clarified, and even primitive. In Alta California, Upper California, governed by Mexico, Spanish Franciscans established missions, beginning with Mission Basilica San Diego de Alcala in 1769. There's a naive attempt at the classical orders around the door. Old San Luis Rey de Francia in Oceanside, built in 1815. Santa Ynez, founded in 1804, shows a classical influence in the brown pilasters flanking the entrance in an otherwise severe facade. Classical pilasters again, awkwardly, at Mission Santa Barbara, built in 1786. Baroque touches in San Carlos Borromeo de Carmelo in Carmel in 1770. And the last, Mission San Francisco, 1833 in Sonoma, looking a lot like a mid-20th century California motel. Near Tucson, Arizona, Spanish Jesuits founded the Mission San Javier del Bac, completed in 1797. The rich ornamentation around the entrance is called churrigueresque, a word I've tried to pronounce correctly for more than 50 years. Sometimes called ultra-Baroque, easier to say, churrigueresque refers to a Spanish Baroque style of elaborate sculptural architectural ornament. The style emerged as a manner of stucco decoration in Spain in the late 17th century. Churrigueresque is marked by extreme, expressive, and florid decorative detailing, normally found around the entrance on the main facade of a building and in altarpieces. We see it in the cathedral in Mexico City, although even with the churrigueresque exuberance, I think San Javier is better composed, restrained, and easily the most elegant of the Spanish missions I know. San Javier is built of brick, coated in stucco. The small size of the brick and a brick's rectilinearity allow for precision in a Latin cross plan that is highly regular. The walls are much thinner compared to the adobe Pueblo churches. Here is San Javier's Baroque nave. The Baroque style originated in Rome in the late 16th century. This is Francesco Borromini's San Carlo al Quattro Fontane, built in Rome in 1638. Borromini took the classical elements of the Renaissance and rearranged them in such a way as to create a space in which your eyes can't stay still. The qualities most frequently associated with the Baroque are movement, grandeur, theatricality, sensuous richness, and emotional exuberance. In the time of the Counter-Reformation, the style expressed the triumph of the Catholic Church. Most Baroque church interiors are multicolored, but the white of Borromini's nave highlights the intense, fluid Baroque space. In New Mexico, San Javier's churrigueresque altarpiece and the dome at the transept or crossing. Ansel Adams photographed San Javier in 1968. French-Canadian colonists founded the village of Sainte-Geneviève in 1735 on the Mississippi River in what is now Missouri. The Becket-Ribot house now pronounced Saint Genevieve, is a surviving example of French colonial architecture. The French colonial style is also known as Creole because it combines building practices from France, the Caribbean, Africa, and the West Indies that mitigated hot summer weather. This house is built in what's called poteaux en terre, or posts in the earth construction, in which cedar logs were driven directly into the ground. They carry a wide-open gallery that surrounds the house and a double-hipped roof. A double-hipped roof is self-bracing, requiring less diagonal bracing, and has no gables at the ends. Inherently more stable than a gabled roof, a double-hipped roof is thus more resistant to damage caused by wind hitting flat gable ends. This was a question asked at last Thursday's class. The courthouse in Cahokia, Illinois, was built as a French dwelling circa 1740. The building served as Lewis and Clark's headquarters in 1803 and 1804. The building was moved to St. Louis for the 1904 World's Fair and back by way of a Chicago exhibition in 1906. The construction method here is poteau sur sol, upright, meaning posts on a sill. Upright logs are seated on a horizontal log sill. The spaces between logs are filled with stone and mortar chinking. The roof is double-hipped. At Parlange Plantation, built in 1750 in Pointe Coupee Parish, Louisiana, we can see the Creole precedent employed in a much larger house in an even hotter climate. Storage and service rooms are on the ground floor within cool masonry walls. The kitchen was in a detached building. As on the ground floor, there are no hallways on the second floor. In an arrangement known as ensuite, you get from room to room by way of the porch and the colonnade on the ground floor. Parlange is still standing, restored and open to the public, but I usually prefer these black and white photographs from the Historic American Building Survey in the 1930s. They're better at illustrating the built forms we're talking about, while recent photographs tend to make a house look brand new. There are a lot more lived in the old photographs. Visit these restored plantation houses now, and the windows are never open. The air conditioning is on, but you know they had to be open in hot, centuries-old real life. During the Civil War, Marie Virginie Ternant was the mistress of Parlange. She saved the house from destruction throughout its occupation by both the Union and Confederate armies. Her granddaughter, Virginie Amélie Avegno-Gautreau, became a Parisian socialite known for her beauty. She is most widely known as the subject of John Singer Sargent's painting, Portrait of Madame X, which created a scandal when exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1884. In 1799, outside the Vieux Carré along Bayou St. John, Don Bartholomé Bosque built a country retreat known now as the Pitot House. The house was named for a 19th century mayor of New Orleans who lived in the house. The French colonial style is apparent in the colonnade and gallery and in the double-hipped roof. The plan is ensuite, meaning there are no interior hallways. The colonnade and gallery are used to get from room to room on both floors. The first floor bathrooms here are modern additions. There is an inset loggia on the first floor and on the second floor, with louvered shutters at the second floor, reached by this elegant outdoor stair. Designed to withstand flooding, the ground floor flooded as intended, and the Pitot House was able to survive Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In the Vieux Carré, only 2 French colonial structures survived the fires that ravaged the city during the Spanish occupation. One of them is the Ursuline Convent, completed in 1751 in a formal, austere French neoclassical style. The other is the house called Madame John's Legacy, built in 1788 and still standing on Dumaine Street. The only example of an urban French colonial or Creole house. Madame John's has the characteristic double-hipped roof and a gallery on the street side. Madame John's courtyard recalls that at the Gonzalez Alvarez house, built about 50 years earlier, in Spanish St. Augustine. Now, it would be easy to mistake this building for a French colonial plantation house. Double-hipped roof, gallery around the house. But this is Van Cortlandt Manor, built around 1732 by Dutch colonists in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, in the Hudson River Valley. The house is built of stone and brick, the galleries of wood. Van Cortlandt Manor is built into a hillside, and the galleries run only partly around the house. The Dutch West India Company purchased Manhattan Island in 1626. They founded the town of New Amsterdam at the southern tip of the island. The plan recalls that of a medieval Dutch town. Streets are curved, and the houses are built to the lot line. There's even a canal, and the town was fortified by a defensive rampart with bastions along what is now known as Wall Street. In building New Amsterdam, the colonists looked to home and models typical of Dutch cities and towns at the time. These are 17th century Dutch houses in Amsterdam and Haarlem with elaborate gables. This stair-step-like profile here is known as a crow-stepped gable. Relatively simple to build. You don't have to cut any bricks for a gable. This is a weighing house built in 1482 in Uitwater, near Utrecht. The building shares features with houses shown on Broad Street in Manhattan about 1700, with the city's first city hall at about the same time, and with the Dutch State House, drawn here as it was in 1679. The so-called rigging house at 120 William Street was said to be the last remaining Dutch building from New Amsterdam until it was replaced by the Len & Fink building in 1900. Len & Fink are gone now too. The Dutch colonial revival style was popular at the turn of the 20th century. These facades were built on William Street in Manhattan in 1903. Lastly, a crow-stepped gable can be seen in American illustrator Howard Pyle's 1895 painting, The First Slave Auction, at New Amsterdam in 1655. Now we'll talk about English colonials and their American successors next week. I'm happy to take questions by email, but please no texts. And I look forward to seeing you next week.